speaking of Fangraphs, we talked about the projections for Corbin Carroll, but Fangraphs kind of surprised us because they had a certain Arizona Diamondback player listed as a potential breakout for 2024, and it was not the person I think a lot of people would think of as a potential breakout. Fangraphs listed Kyle Nelson as a breakout star or potential breakout player for the Diamondbacks in 2024. And I mean, what were your thoughts on seeing him on there?
Well, first of all, it's not just Fangraphs at large. This is friend of the show, Dan Szymboski.
That's right.
So it carries weight. Although maybe the neural network came up with this. I'm not totally sure.
I mean, sometimes Dan does let the computers do a lot of the work.
I mean, his mind is basically a computer at this point.
That
so it's all one and the same. What Dan wrote about Kyle Nelson, here's what he had to say. Have you seen his slider? The double whammy of a very high home run rate and a high BABIP served to keep Kyle Nelson's ERA relatively high in what could very well have been his breakout season. And even then, all it took was a brutal September to dive bomb his seasonal numbers.
Correct.
Dan continues, if Nelson finishes with an ERA above 4 in 2024 over at least 30 innings, I'll eat a full order of Cincinnati chili. And as those that are familiar with me can attest, that's not something I relish doing. So Dan Szymboski is putting himself out there, willing to even eat Cincinnati chili, which I don't know. Is that bad? Cincinnati chili bad?
Skyline chili?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a thing. They love their chili in Cincinnati. I mean, Kyle Nelson has been a guy at times that we've spoke very highly of, and we know that he has been a guy that Torrey has spoke very highly of. We know he's kind of a vital part of their bullpen, and they've said that for the last 2 seasons. Torrey spoke today about where Kyle Nelson factors into the bullpen this year, and this is what he had to say.
Yeah, I mean, he was one of our main guys last year, and he threw the ball extremely well. I know I maybe overused him, and he got a little fatigued, and we had to back off of him later in the season. So my expectation is it'll still remain the same. He's got to come in here and continue to pitch and pitch well, and make sure he's ready for the start of a season.
Now, Tim in the chat says if Kyle Nelson is our breakout candidate, we're screwed. I don't think that's what he's meaning as much as
he's not saying that Kyle Nelson is going to be the best player on the Diamondbacks.
Correct.
He just every year Dan Szymboski makes lists of pitchers that he thinks are breakout candidates and pitchers that he views as bust candidates. And there are very good and somewhat unknown pitchers on both of those lists. It's not really to say like these are the best or the worst players on their respective teams or anything. But I do understand where Dan is what Dan is getting at here. As you heard Torrey talk about there, Kyle Nelson's certainly a factor in the Diamondbacks bullpen in 2024. We don't know exactly what it will look like. We don't know if he will make the opening day roster. I think he will. I would lean in that direction just based on what he's given the team over the last couple years. But to Dan's point, Kyle Nelson's slider has been a very good pitch. It had a whiff rate just over 40% last year, which is legit. That means that almost half the time that opposing hitters are swinging at the Kyle Nelson slider, they are coming up empty. That is a pretty big deal. And really what happened to him last year is his fastball just got hit really hard. Opposing hitters hit 321 with a 556 slugging percentage against Kyle Nelson's fastball. There were a lot of homers, especially in the second half of the season. D-backs didn't use him in as many big situations toward the end of the year. But yeah, the expected numbers are definitely better than the actual. I think there's some evidence he got a bit unlucky there. And yeah, we'll see what it looks like in 2024.
We don't know if he's going to start on the major league roster, but he has started on the minor league roster the last 2 seasons. And Torrey talked about him being competitive and showing a little bit of that fire in regards to it. I think, when it comes to how well these guys take this information, there's kind of a balance, right?
Yeah.
And I think a manager like Torey Lovullo, who sizes up his fellow managers and decides, how he could beat them in a fight, is also looking for some fight out of these guys, even when he's delivering, bad news. I'm sure he wants them to handle it with maturity and, with some professionalism, but I'm sure he also wants to tell them, I'm sure he doesn't mind it when guys tell him, I'm going to prove you wrong, or I'll be back, or, something kind of like in the face of that information. This is what Torrey had to say about Kyle Nelson when he was told the last 2 seasons that he would be starting in the minors.
Yeah. he's always breaking down walls. He's always challenging himself to get better every single day, and takes things in stride as good as any player I've ever been around. It's his personality. He doesn't like some of those things that have happened in the past. You're right. Last year we had a left-handed pitcher or somebody go down the day before camp was breaking. It was Mantiply. And we basically recalled him, and he spent 0 days in the minor leagues. But he didn't like it. He expressed it and didn't let it affect him. He went down and continued to pitch well enough, and he was ready when we called him back up. So it's about who he is. That's exactly what he's able to handle. He's persevered his whole career. He's been a fighter his whole career. And he's, like I said, he's always breaking down walls in front of him.
Yeah, always breaking down walls. And I mean, obviously, you want to see these guys getting better. And Kyle Nelson is a guy who, if he can be better paired with that slider, he could be a very big weapon for Torrey out of the bullpen.
Yeah, and he, as Torrey was talking about there, Kyle Nelson really has been through it the last couple seasons. In 2022, it was one Oliver Perez who was brought in trying to make a one last go at being a solid left-handed reliever in this league. He made the Diamondbacks opening day roster, and Kyle Nelson, I believe it was for the second consecutive year, Kyle Nelson lost out on a roster spot because of Oliver Perez. It happened to him, I think, in Cleveland the year prior, and then last year, as Torrey talked about, Kyle Nelson had been told that he would not be on the opening day roster. He'd be starting the year in Reno. And then Joe Mantiply got hurt right before the regular season.
That's right.
And Kyle Nelson actually wound up starting the year on the opening day roster and played a really big role for the D-backs, especially in the first half of the season. So, is Kyle Nelson going to be a high leverage arm for the D-backs? Probably not. The slider is a good pitch. The fastball, I think, gets hit around a little bit in the low 90s, but we've seen it, right? I mean, in 2022, Kyle Nelson was really good and for the entire season, and last year he got bit by the long ball quite a bit toward the end of the year. Maybe we see him get that under control a bit here in 2024.